fate.
What the hell is Volturi and how they appeared? What if I tell you they were much worse than you think? Probably for you they are the ancient vampire rulers who enforce the law, protect vampire secrecy. But what if that's not the whole story? Did you know that Ara may have been responsible for the death of his own sister? Did you know that the Volturi often recruited gifted vampires whether they wanted to join or not? The deeper you look into the history of the Volturi, the darker it becomes. So, who really were the Volturi? How did they become the most feared vampires in the world? And if they were so dangerous, why did Carlisle Cullen join them? Today we're diving into the complete dark history of the Volturi. When most people think about the Twilight history, they imagine the Volturi as something eternal, as if they had always existed, as if Ara, Marcus, and Caius had always ruled the vampire world. But that's not true. Long before the Volturi became powerful vampires lived in independent covens spread across the world. There were no universal laws, no central authority, no vampire government. The strongest of these early groups was the Romanian coven. For centuries, the Romanians dominated vampire society. They ruled through fear and strength, and nobody seriously challenged the authority. But while the Romanians were building their empire, another group was slowly taking shape. That group originally emerged in ancient Greece. The future Volturi were founded by Ara, Marcus, and Caius. They were later joined by Ara's wife Sulpicia. Yes, Ara had a wife, and also, Caius had a wife. Caius' wife was Athena, and also there was Ara's younger sister, Didyme. At the time, they were not rulers, lawmakers, or judges. They were simply a growing coven gathering influence, allies, and gifted vampires. And at the center of the story was Ara. Even as a human, Ara was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply curious. Unlike many vampires who simply wanted to survive, Ara wanted knowledge. He wanted influence, control. After becoming a vampire, he developed one of the most powerful gifts in existence. By touching someone, Ara could see every thought they had ever had, every memory, secret, lie, nothing could be hidden from him. Most vampires would use a gift like that to gain information. Ara used it to gain power. His ability gave him an advantage over every rival he would ever face. Ara didn't need spies when he could simply touch someone and instantly learn everything they knew. Eventually, Ara met another vampire named Marcus. Marcus possessed a very different ability. He could see the emotional bonds connecting people. He could instantly understand relationships, loyalties, and attachments. Together, Ara and Marcus became close allies. Marcus could identify love, loyalty, devotion, and trust instantly. Combined with Ara's mind-reading ability, the two possessed an extraordinary understanding of other vampire. Later, a third vampire joined them. His name was Caius. Unlike Ara and Marcus, Caius had no known supernatural gift, but what he lacked in powers, he made up for in aggression and ruthlessness. He believed survival belonged to the strong, and he was willing to do almost anything to achieve it. Caius would eventually become the most paranoid of three leaders. Many of the Volturi's harshest policies would later be shaped by his fear of potential threat. Together, these three vampires would become the future rulers of the vampire world. But before they become kings, they were simply a coven. A coven that would eventually leave Greece and relocate to Volterra, Italy, a city that would become the center of Volturi power for more than 2,000 years. And soon, of course, their ambitions would grow far. The first major crack of the Volturi image comes from a vampire most movie fans barely remember, Didyme, Ara's younger sister. Didyme possessed a rare gift. She could make people around her feel happiness and contentment. Unlike many vampire gifts, hers wasn't designed for power. It brought peace, and perhaps because of that, she became very close to Marcus. Eventually, Marcus and Didyme fell deeply in love. For the first time in his existence, Marcus was truly happy. The two wanted to leave the Volturi and travel the world together. And that's where the story becomes disturbing. According to Twilight canon, Aro secretly viewed Marcus as too valuable to lose. Marcus wasn't just his friend, he was an essential part of his plans. Without Marcus and his gift, the future Volturi would be weaker, and so Aro made a horrifying decision. Rather than allow Marcus to live, he arranged for Didyme to die, his own sister, murdered because her resistance threatened Aro's ambitions. The truth was hidden from Marcus. He never knew what really happened. Instead, Marcus spent centuries trapped inside the Volturi, grieving a loss he never truly understood. And Marcus spent years trying to discover who had murdered Didyme. When he failed, he became emotionally shattered. He became effectively suicidal after losing the only person he truly loved. And this is where we begin to understand who Aro really was. But beneath that image was a vampire, willing to sacrifice anyone for power, even his own family. And unfortunately, it wasn't the last part when Aro manipulated. After Didyme's death, Marcus changed forever. The passionate and thoughtful vampire who once dreamed of traveling the world with the woman he loved, he was gone. And for Aro, that was useful. Marcus no longer had desire to live. He remained at Aro's side, helping build what would eventually become the most powerful coven in history. But the Volturi was still far from ruling the vampire world. The Romanian coven remained the dominant power. Aro wanted to control vampire society. He needed something more than strength. He needed loyalty. And this is where another important vampire enters the story. Chelsea. Most Twilight fans barely remember her, yet she may have been one of the most important members of the Volturi. Chelsea possessed a terrifying gift. She could strengthen emotional bonds between people, or weaken them. In other words, she could make vampires feel attached to the Volturi, or make them feel disconnected from everyone else. Imagine how powerful the ability is. A vampire joins the Volturi. At first, they are uncertain. Maybe they miss their family, maybe they want to leave, but over time, Chelsea strengthens the connection to the Volturi and weakens their attachment to everyone else. Eventually, living no longer feels natural. The Volturi become their family, their purpose, their entire world. This is one of the darkest details in Twilight lore, because many members of the Volturi were not necessarily loyal by choice. Their loyalty may have been influenced for centuries. Chelsea became especially important after Marcus lost Didyme. Aro used her ability to strengthen Marcus's attachment to the Volturi and prevent him from completely withdrawing from existence. Without Chelsea, Marcus might have abandoned the coven entirely. But ironically, Chelsea herself may not have been entirely free. Another Volturi vampire named Corin possessed a unique gift that could create feelings of satisfaction, comfort, and contentment. Corin was frequently used on important members of the Volturi to ensure they remained happy with their lives inside the coven. Many fans believe Corin's gift was also used to make sure Chelsea never wanted to leave. And another vampire, Chelsea's maid Afton, was another member of the guard. Although his abilities were far less impressive than hers, Aro ensured that Chelsea always had what she wanted because her power was essential to the entire Volturi system. And what we can tell about Aro now. And now he was ready for even something bigger. He was ready to challenge the Romanian coven. Eventually, war became unavoidable. The details of the conflict are largely lost to history. But one thing is clear, it was devastating. The two strongest vampire powers in the world collided, and when the war finally ended, the Volturi emerged victorious. The Romanian Empire collapsed. The Volturi became the new rulers of vampire society. This moment changed everything, because from that point forward, no longer behaved like an ordinary coven. They became something much closer to a government. They created laws, enforced rules, they punished those who threatened vampire secrecy. Officially, these laws existed to protect vampires, and to be fair, some of them did. If humans discovered the existence of vampires, it could lead to chaos and endless conflict. But there was another side to the story, because every new law also increased the Volturi's authority. The line between protecting the vampire world and controlling vampire world became increasingly blurred, and Aro seemed perfectly comfortable with that. But defeating the Romanians wasn't the end of the Volturi's expansion. One, they secured control of vampire society. Another, powerful coven became a target, the Egyptians. The Egyptian coven was one of the oldest and strongest vampire groups in existence. A brutal conflict followed. By the time it ended, only 2 survivors remained, Amun and Kebi. The defeat of the Egyptians further strengthened Volturi authority and sent a clear message to every vampire in the world. Resistance was becoming increasingly hopeless. As the Volturi expanded their influence, Aro developed a new obsession: gifted vampires. Aro loved collecting powerful abilities. Whenever he discovered a gifted vampire, he became interested. Sometimes he invited them to join, sometimes he pressured them, and sometimes the invitation didn't feel much like a choice. Aro understood something very important: a gifted vampire could be more valuable than an entire army. So he began building a collection, not of treasures, not of wealth, but of powers. Some vampires joined willingly, others were far less enthusiastic. Yet somehow the Volturi kept growing stronger and stronger and stronger. One of the most important members involved in this process was Eleazar. Before joining the Denali coven, Eleazar served within the Volturi guard. His special gift allowed him to identify supernatural abilities in both vampires and humans. Can you imagine? That's really cool. In many ways, Eleazar acted as Aro's talent scout, helping locate individuals who might become useful additions to the Volturi. Other famous examples included Demetri, Renata, and Heidi. Demetri possessed one of the greatest tracking gifts in vampire history. Once he found someone's mental trail, escaping he was nearly impossible. Renata possessed a defensive gift capable of redirecting threats away from her. Her ability became one of the main reasons Aro was so difficult to assassinate. Heidi played a different role. Her extraordinary attractiveness allowed her to lure groups of unsuspecting humans directly into Volturi hands. Not all of these vampires originally intended to join the Volturi, but thanks to Chelsea's influence and Aro's determination, many eventually became permanent members of the coven. Eventually, they became almost impossible to challenge, but then they discovered 2 children who would change everything: Jane and Alec. If Aro was building an empire, Jane and Alec, they were his ultimate weapons. The twins were born in England centuries ago. Even as humans, they were different. People feared them, distrusted them, and eventually accused them of witchcraft. According to Twilight lore, they were sentenced to death. But before they could be executed, Aro arrived. He recognized their potential immediately, and he transformed them. The result was terrifying. Jane developed the ability to inflict unbearable pain using only her mind. She didn't physically harm her victims. She simply convinced their brain that they were experiencing agony. Victims collapsed screaming, unable to fight, unable to think, unable to defend themselves. Her brother Alec was arguably even more dangerous. He could completely remove a person's sensory perception: sight, hearing, touch, everything. Alec could turn entire battlefields into helpless statues. Together, the twins made the Volturi nearly unbeatable, and once again, Aro gained exactly what he wanted. At this point, the Volturi were not simply leaders, they were fear. And perhaps that fear was exactly what Aro wanted. The true scale of Jane and Alec's power became clear when the Romanian coven attempted to reclaim its former position. For years, the surviving Romanians dreamed of overthrowing the Volturi and restoring the lost empire. Then they encountered Jane and Alec. The twins were unleashed against them, and the result was devastating. The challenge collapsed almost immediately. After that, few vampires seriously believed the Volturi could be defeated through force alone. Jane and Alec didn't simply strengthen the Volturi, they made the coven seem untouchable. But despite all of this darkness, there was one vampire who saw something different in the Volturi. His name was Carlisle Cullen. Of all vampires in Twilight, Carlisle Cullen, the most surprising person to have ever joined the Volturi. Today, Carlisle is known for his compassion, his refusal to kill humans, his belief that vampires and humans can coexist peacefully. In many ways, he represents the exact opposite of everything the Volturi stand for. So why did he join them? The answer is actually very simple. Loneliness. After Carlisle was transformed into a vampire, he spent years struggling to accept what he had become. Unlike most vampires, he refused to drink human blood. Instead, he searched desperately for another way to survive. For a long time, he believed he was completely alone. Then he heard rumors about an ancient coven living in Italy. Curious and desperate for companionship, Carlisle traveled to Volterra. What he found there surprised him. At the time, the Volturi were already powerful, but they were not exactly the villains that movie audiences often imagine. They were highly educated. They collected books, art, and knowledge. They spent centuries studying history, philosophy, science, and culture. Arroy, in particular, was fascinated by Carlisle. Carlisle represented something incredibly rare, a vampire who rejected violence whenever possible, a vampire who genuinely cared about others, and perhaps, most importantly, a vampire whose thoughts could not be manipulated through fear. Arroy admired him. The two became friends. Yes, Arroy and Carlisle were friends. For a time, Carlisle lived among the Volturi. He learned from them, studied with them, shared ideas with them, and despite the differences, there was real mutual respect between Carlisle and Arroy. But eventually, Carlisle began noticing something disturbing. The Volturi's goals were not the same as his. Carlisle valued life, the Volturi valued power, and Carlisle believed gifts should be used responsibly. And the longer he stayed, the more obvious these differences became. Eventually, he made a decision. He left, not because he hated the Volturi, not because he feared them, but because he knew he could never become what they wanted him to be. Interestingly, Arroy didn't want Carlisle to leave. In fact, Arroy spent centuries trying to convince him to return. Even during the events of the Twilight Saga, Arroy repeatedly offers Carlisle a place within the Volturi. That alone tells us how highly Arroy regarded him. Carlisle was one of the few vampires Arroy genuinely respected, but he was also one of the few vampires who could never be controlled. And perhaps that's exactly why Carlisle left. Because unlike many others, he realized what the Volturi becoming. An empire. Not a family, not a community, an empire. Also, I want to talk about Caius, because for most of the Twilight Saga, Caius appears to be the least interesting of the three leaders. It seems like he's angry for no obvious reason. But there is a reason, and I will tell you now the story, how he almost died because of the werewolves. Unlike most creatures in the Twilight universe, true werewolves possess abilities capable of killing vampires. One encounter left Caius deeply traumatized. For perhaps the first time in centuries, he experienced genuine fear. And Caius never forgot it. After that experience, he became obsessed with eliminating werewolves wherever they could be found. He pushed the Volturi to hunt them across Europe and Asia. Entire populations were driven close to extinction. By the time of the Twilight Saga, true werewolves had become incredibly rare. And these details helps explain many of Caius' actions. His paranoia, his aggression, his constant desire to destroy potential threats before they become dangerous. So, what are Volturi evil? The answer isn't completely simple. Without them, vampire society might be descended into chaos. But that's only part of the story, because behind it, something much darker. Arrow's manipulation, the death of Didyme, the control exercised through Chelsea, and recruitment of gifted vampires. So, thank you for watching this video. I hope this video was useful and you knew some new information, and you can write in the comments what video I should do next. Maybe dedicate the whole video to each character, or maybe talk about other movies.